Hello and welcome to another edition of Wes's Net How-Tos. In this series of today's episodes, what we're going to be doing is going through a TSA Teams competition for some of our high school students that regularly compete in a Teams-based competition. And this year's 2013 Teams competition is actually based on information security. And so one of my colleagues had asked me if I might be able to provide a little more help to some of these high school students as they're researching and currently working on and just gathering information on how to compete in this competition. And so they sent to me this PDF that I'm going to load up for you. And what this PDF has is it kind of documents the this year's TSA Teams competition, and essentially what it has is, if you look through here, and I know I'm going somewhat quickly, but it's got 8 different scenarios, and all of them center around information security. And so they all go from everything from malware to other types of other phishing, as you see right here, phishing-based attacks, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, just really a whole host of different attacks, vulnerabilities, and threats that we might face in the world of cybersecurity. And as many of you know, just jumping into this topic, the second you take a foot in, you feel like you're already underwater in technical requirements. And one of the things about information security is that it really builds upon a solid prior knowledge of a topic or technology, and you can't really understand cybersecurity and the security threats and the security implications behind a technology until you know the technology itself. And so this is what makes, I think, this year's 2013 competition such a fun challenge, but also realistically such a difficult challenge as well, because students are required to write and plan and practice for security of devices and technologies that they may not know a whole lot about. And so what I would like to do today is basically go through a set of information that really kind of outlines each scenario and gives more information to the student in preparation for this competition. And so that's what we're going to be doing. If you don't know who I am, my name is Wes Spencer. I work in the Telecommunications Systems Management program at Murray State University. I'm an instructor there, and I teach a couple of different junior and senior level information security courses. And so really this is what I do, this is who I am, and this is what I enjoy so much. And so what I'm going to try to do in this video tutorial is really stay hands off. We're going to try our best not to be too technical, and because I think most of you understand why, but the more technical we get, the quicker many people who are watching this video are going to become overwhelmed. And so while some or maybe most of my videos are very, very hands-on and very, very technical, this one we're purposely going to stay 10,000 foot view. We're going to try to stick to the technologies, the topics, the problems, and we're not going to introduce too much technically, because in order to do that we would have to talk about so much prior to it. So again, this is for the TSA Teams 2013 competition, and really hope you enjoy this video and hope it will be useful to you. And so what we're going to cover here, you have to ignore my graphic, apparently got covered up. We have eight different scenarios, as we had mentioned before, and the idea here is 3 different things. Well, actually, I think eight different scenarios. And so let's quickly go through each of these scenarios. The first scenario is, it says, by using countermeasures, engineers can design ways to deter phishing attempts and phishing attacks. So we're going to talk about that, what a phishing attack is, what makes them effective, what kinds there are, and what we can do to prevent them. Second scenario, engineers can design safeguards that protect web apps from attackers. And so this is going to be things like we just talked about before, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, things like that. Thirdly, engineers can design protections to prevent vulnerable wireless networks from breaches by external attacks. So we're going to talk about wireless, how it works, some of the threats we face, where we've been and where we're going with it. Fourthly, engineers can design solutions to protect websites from organized cyber attacks. by protesters whose intention is to slow down or shut down a web server. So we're going to look at denial of service, distributed denial of service, or what we call DDoS attacks, and even some other things that you may not have thought about when it comes to organized attacks like this in such a large scale, large nature. Scenario 5, engineers can design methods to secure free Wi-Fi hotspots. I know you probably didn't think it, but there are things we can do to secure a free-to-use hotspot, and we need to consider those things. Number 6, engineers can protect computer systems from malicious software. And so this one and I think scenario 8 are very, very similar together, so I'm probably going to group those together. Number 7, engineers can prevent insider attacks from an abuse by using technological methods and procedural controls that provide oversight of employees. So being aware of not only what our employees are doing, but data as it flows in and out of our organization. And then 8th, as I said, this is very similar to 6, so designing spyware countermeasures. And so we'll talk about what spyware is and some of the risks that it poses as well. So first of all, let's go ahead and talk about scenario 1. We talked about phishing. The idea is designing methods that will deter phishing attempts, but we don't really know what phishing is. So here's what phishing is. Basically, it's a deception mechanism. And what we mean by deception mechanism is a tool or a utility that uses people tricking people. And of course, the means by which this is accomplished, of course, is through computers, but really this relies not upon any kind of elite, sophisticated, criminal-based attack that uses, vulnerabilities that maybe had never been seen before. Rather, this just tries to play on people's natural ability to trust one another. So this really falls under the category of social engineering. If you've never heard of that topic, it essentially means violating the trust that humans naturally have for one another. For example, how do you know that I really know what I'm talking about, right? Couldn't I just be making all this up until now, till me just mentioning this? You probably trusted me. So social engineering is something that we see is quite effective because people naturally want to trust one another. When we get information from someone, we naturally want to trust it. It's the fabric of who we are as people, and unfortunately, it can be misused and used to gain a distinct advantage by bad guys. So phishing specifically is the act of tricking a user by masquerading as a legitimate company. In other words, we send them information, we try to make it look like it's legitimate, but in reality it's not. Right? And what they're after here by doing this and this kind of attack, and I'll show you some examples of this attack, I mean, ultimately they're after your user account, your password, financial data that they might be able to get inside of it, and potentially, if they can't get that, at least some other kind of personally identifiable information. I can't say that. PII, that's what we always say, PII, stands for personally identifiable information. And so that's really what they're going after, is your information. Symantec has said that 1 in 299 overall phishing attempts occur by email. So 1 in 299 emails that we get, statistically speaking, are phishing. That is a staggering number. If I think about how many emails I get, sometimes it seems like it is at least 300 a day, probably more across all my email accounts. It's very common that I even notice that I get these phishing attacks. So one question for us, does it work? The answer is yes. Many people are starting to learn not to trust the basic attacks that we see, some of the simple-based phishing attacks. But unfortunately, the fact is they work. If they didn't work, people would not be still attempting these attacks and this type of technology. They would have moved on to something else. So unfortunately, we have proven statistically they really do work, unfortunately. And the methodology, the scope, it ranges from simple attacks that are easy to detect that most people should already be aware of, all the way down to very complex, very thoughtfully calculated attacks that are maybe specifically against a single person or a single company. And unfortunately, those are very, very humorous. I'm sorry, very, very effective. Now, humorous, however, is this little Dilbert comic strip. I've pasted it in here for you. I think it's very, very humorous and really touches on the truth to all of this. Now, first of all, why do we call it phishing? Have you ever wondered that? Why is it spelled PH? right? We know it seems like it says phishing, except we've got a PH for an F. Is that just because we're cool? And it looks cooler? The actual reason is it comes from a combination or conglomeration of two different words. One was phreaking. Back in the 1970s, there was this term called phreaking. And what this was a method of essentially making free phone calls. And it worked. There was actually this little Captain Crunch whistle, and you can look up on Wikipedia all the history behind it. I think it's fascinating. Definitely not legal, but fascinating, and how a lot of this worked. And so this is a way of breaking a known vulnerable system to get free phone calls. Now, today, people think, well, what's the point of that? I pretty much got that all the time on my wireless phone, and that may be true, but keep in mind back in the 70s, it was not the case, and this was highly valuable. So that was a term that was thrown around, was created by a hacking community. And really stayed popular for a long time. And then, of course, phishing, we all know what that is. We've been doing that since the dawn of time. We take some kind of bait, some kind of lure, some kind of mechanism, and cast it into some area, usually water, and see what happens, right? Can we control every single time when the fish bites? No. Can we control specifically which fish bites? No. But can we use mechanisms by which we might attract certain fish? Yes. Can we try at certain times, certain ways, certain methodologies that work better than others? Yes. So this is an idea of combining those two ideas, and that's where phishing with a PH actually came about in terms of how we look at it, how we spell it. Really, a lot of this started in around 1995 against AOL users. I don't know if you remember those days, but AOL was pretty much the predominant internet access provider. You could go to Walmart or any other computer-based store, CompUSA, any of those, and they had just big spindles of AOL disk that you could get for free in 40 hours of free AOL internet access, right? And so back then in those days, as email was just coming about, this is where we first saw some of the very first phishing attacks, where people were getting basically free account usernames and passwords. They would send an email to someone, and I think I'll show you an example of this later on, but it would point them to places that were not AOL, but really to an unsuspecting user looked like it. So take a look at this right here. One of them, they would point to AO1.com, hoping a user would not realize the 1 for the L and just go right there. Just click on the link and head right over, and it was a false AOL. Looked like the real AOL and everything else, and they would be tricked into giving their username and password out. Bad guy would then get, their credentials and could log in as them and get free internet. So was this sophisticated? Oh, no, of course not, right? However, it was effective because up until now, no one had ever seen a phishing-based attack, and so it actually worked quite well. Fast forward to around 2001, we begin to see phishing attacks and phishing attempts against eBay and major banks. So people would basically take a typical screenshot of a bank, or at least the logo, and pop in some information about, hey, we need your account information, or we're going to delete your account, blah, 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 blah. And people would receive this email, and it says, well, it's got eBay's logo on it, so it must be legit, right? And of course, it wasn't. They didn't work very well, but they were effective. They were easy to detect, but again, many users had never seen this before back in 2001, and so they would just naturally kind of trust what the email said. So this was effective. Now let's go about 6 more years up to 2007. Now we begin to see a little bit more calculated types of attacks, ones that are going against PayPal, banks. We still see eBay, but we definitely see a financial motivator behind all this, don't we? And we see that a lot of this is going and geared specifically towards getting financial information. So some of the techniques, maybe the link would have some kind of browser vulnerability in it. It would actually take a user to a website that had a known vulnerability. People still today don't update browsers very well unless you use Chrome or one of the auto-updating based browsers. And so they would essentially own your browser and therefore own your machine, install malware, install some kind of rootkit, keylogger, whatever, and be able to see what you're entering in as your information. My father actually had fallen for one of these around this time frame, and he called me right up and realized what he did, because he went back to the site again. He clicked on the link again, and he entered in false username and a false password that was not his, and it said, oh, thank you for your information. This was correct. And so that's how he knew it was a phishing attack. So he immediately closed all of that down, went to the real PayPal, and reset his his user or reset his password, and he never ended up having anything happen. But he was smart enough to detect this seems wrong. It seems fishy, for, well, no pun intended, right? Then we see some ones that are current, 2008 up until now, that are very sophisticated, very dedicated. Sometimes we refer to these as spear phishing attacks, and the reason we call it spear phishing rather than just generically phishing is because rather than creating some kind of fake email and just kind of sending it out to the masses and seeing who might bite on it, almost like a form of spam, rather we create a very calculated, very specific email, and we might send it to just one user. So perhaps we look up information about who this user is. We find information from them on maybe LinkedIn, find out some of their work associates, and custom craft an email that is purportedly from a work associate. It has information that looks very legitimate, seems to be very close to the typical email they might get. Maybe is not going to have a foolish, text like, you need to click here, your bank account will be deleted, but rather, hey Bob, I noticed that, you went to this conference the other day. We found that out from LinkedIn. And, here's some follow-up information and maybe some PDF I wanted to send you. Go ahead and click on this, right? So now we see spear phishing based attacks that are very calculated, and those unfortunately are very, very effective. Many of my students end up going into a field called penetration testing after graduating in the TSM program, and part of what some of them will do is spear phishing based attacks, where they'll pick an employee from a company, and again they're hired to do this, they're legally doing this, keep this in mind, and they have found that these spear phishing attacks are very effective because it is a calculated attack. It's specifically for one person. They do the research ahead of time, and unfortunately it's very, very believable. Okay, so how about some statistics? These are not ones I made up. These either come from the Federal Trade Commission or they come from APWG, the Anti-Phishing Working Group. So look at this. Out of 2 million emails sent, 5% of these phishing attacks get to the end user. All right? So that means they bypass your anti-spam. I use Gmail. A lot of people use Gmail. I still regularly see phishing attacks come right through in the email. And I always click to mark them as spam, hoping we can add to Google's database and get that stuff out of there. But unfortunately, these things slip through. 5% of people click on these phishing links. 5,000 of that 100,000 that get through. So again, we think no one would believe this stuff anymore. Unfortunately, they do. 2% of those enter data into the phishing site itself. 100 people. All right, 100 people. Now, the FTC estimates every single person that does that, the average loss is $1,200. Now, it may not be just that person. It might be the bank. It might be time lost in sorting all this ID theft out. But the potential reward from one phishing email sent out is about $120,000. It's very difficult to catch these people. And so if you could tell me, even if the success rate is so low, the chance of being caught also so low, you can see why people involve and engage in these types of attacks. People do get caught though. In 2005, look at this, and you can read this through news. Just look this guy's name up, David Levi. He made about 360 grand from about 160 people. Got caught, but made some money, right? So you can see why people engage in these kinds of attacks and activities, unfortunately. So why does this work? Again, we've talked about this a little bit, but fact is, a lot of users are still unsuspecting. They get an email. It comes from maybe U.S. Bank, as we're going to show in the next slide, and they say, this looks right. I've got a U.S. Bank account, right? Now, remember how we said back up a slide, only 5% click on the link? Well, maybe that's because 95% of them say, hey, I don't have a U.S. bank account, so I'm not going to trust it. But what about the 5% that do? They get it and say, yeah, that's my bank. That's my logo that I'm used to seeing. It looks like the email I typically get. I guess this is right. So they click on it, and they're taken to a place that still looks relatively trustworthy, right? And so unfortunately, a lot of users don't know how to distinguish between a legitimate site and a fake site. So let's look at some fake ones and use this as a learning example. So here's one. If you look just right here, now granted, this is a few years old, but if you look just right here, looks kind of legitimate, right? Looks like their site, but what's the truth here? Can anyone just grab some HTML source code, grab the images off, and pretty much just serve up a site from this splash page and make it look pretty much like everyone else's? or like the legitimate one? Yeah, it's really not that hard, is it? But there's a couple obvious things to look at. First of all, why is this going from this address, 210.104.211.21? This is an IP address, a public IP address. First of all, why is this not resolving to US Bank, right? Now, just if it did alone, that doesn't mean anything, right? There's still many cases where this could show US Bank and not be US Bank. Secondly, no HTTPS at all. Not at all. So we can tell this is not a sophisticated attack, totally unencrypted session. Secondly, look at this. Go into some directory called ft and then .1 and then complete HTML. Don't know where this directory is. That looks a little odd too, right? Thirdly, your account information will be verified by U.S. Bank Department in the next 24 hours. Wow, there's some great grammar. By U.S. Bank Department. You mean the U.S. Bank Department? What exactly do you mean here, right? Secondly, what bank is going to wait 24 hours to verify your information? Shouldn't this be automatic? I mean, this is what IT does these days, right? So we really can just kind of throw this one aside as this cannot be legitimate, right? Here's another one. This one was from PayPal. This actually came out of the spam folder if you look right here, but you know, if we were to click on it. Now, here's the thing. If you just read this, it looks legitimate. But the thing is, can anyone get a sample email like this? Yeah, just sign up for a free PayPal account. You're going to get an email similar to this, right? So anyone, again, can take all this and take PayPal's actual verbiage and just use this in your own phishing attack, right? And they might say, click here to verify your account, right? So we're going to have to click here, right? And again, notice this is it looks like, oh no, warning, warning. Looks like you're in trouble, which is ironic because that's what this is all about, right? You know, your account was accessed by a foreign IP address. Anyways, here's the interesting thing. Click here to verify your account. If you hold your mouse over it, look where it's going. Is that PayPal? Nope, it is sure not. Now, these people were sophisticated enough to at least take what we typically see in part of their link, the CGI bin, and we see, I don't know if you've noticed this before or not, but this actually looks legitimate. So they're hoping someone's eyes would just hit PayPal right here and go on through, right? But it's very important we check the whole link out. Notice this is going to some unknown IP address. So we can't trust this. This should be obvious. It should be absolutely obvious. Here's another one that just pops up. Notice this one, again, looks pretty legitimate. I'm not showing the address in here, but you can look right through here and look what they're asking us to do. This one's somewhat sophisticated because we can actually enter in information. We can put in an ID, a passcode, re-enter that passcode, and then even put in our ATM and check card number. Yeah, that seems legitimate. Now, here's my question for you. If we are asked by Bank of America to verify our information, why should I ever have to verify to them this information? Now, granted, if I have to reset my password, I'm going to have to verify some amount of information, but why am I ever going to send them some of this information here? I'm not going to need to do it. They should have my information, right? If anything, they should be verifying themselves to me, not me to them. And that's something to keep in mind with these phishing attacks, is they make it look like, hey, you need to do something and verify yourself before we delete you. Wait a second. Does that make sense? Why should I have to verify my information to you? You should already know who I am, right? Here's another one. Dear PayPal, the fact is a lot of these emails, a lot of these phishing attempts are very poorly done, right? Who's going to email and say, Dear PayPal, you don't even know my name? One of the best ways to know if a phishing attempt is, if an email is a phishing attempt is, if you see no information about you yourself, doesn't show your name, doesn't show anything about you, you're just generically spoken of, right? Again, same thing, look here. It looks like the correct link, but it's very easy to put this in as the text, but the actual hyperlink that it points to be completely different. Okay, so another easy way to know that this cannot be right. Also, what in the world is this here? Makes no sense. So, pretty obvious this is not legitimate. Okay. All right. Notice up here, in this case, this one's a little bit more sophisticated. They have actually spoofed this address bar. Now, we do not have time or the ability to technically show how this is being done, but there are 2, 3, 4 different ways that we can actually fake this. All right. So it is easily done, especially on old browsers or insecure browsers. Very easy to do. But do notice that down here, in this old version of IE, notice there should still be that lock down here. And you can double click on this and see the certificate information. It is not showing up. Okay, so we can tell that this is not correct, even though it's made to look correct. All right. So again, one of the things that users need to be aware of is, do we see a lock here? Is there actual certificate information being passed to the browser? Okay, so we showed you some examples. Let's go ahead and talk quickly about some ways that we can deter some of these attacks. Okay, so first of all, the verify your account messages. Here's the fact. No business, like we said before, should ever ask you to verify yourself to them. They shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't make sense. If you know who you are, they should also know who you are. They have your information. They are your bank. They know all about you. Trust me, they know who you are. They know how to get in touch with you. When you haven't paid your bills, they know who to contact. They know where you are. Here's another one. Respond within, 24 hours, 48 hours, or your account is going to be closed. Really? Come on. Even in this economy, we know vendors are not just going to delete our accounts, right? If some bank has my money, or even better for them, they have my debt, do you think they're just going to close my account because I haven't clicked on some link to activate or to verify that I am still who I am? I don't think so. I think they'll be calling me. I think they'll be sending me actual letters in the mail saying, hey, you owe me money. I don't think people are just going to delete your account because of a failure to respond or some kind of inactive use, right? So it just doesn't make sense when we actually think about it. Common sense is critical here. Very, very important. Another one, dear valued customer, right? Again, you don't know my name. You are my vendor. You should know my name. I bank with you. You should know who I am. Don't call me dear valued customer. I'm not going to trust an email like that, right? Another one, hey, you can click the following link to access your account. The truth is, many emails that are legitimate still have this, and we can click the link right in their email and go right there. But here's something I want to go ahead and suggest. Even if the email itself has a click this link to go and access your account, you still have to log in, and it's legitimate, I encourage everyone I talk to, don't do that. If you get an email that says, hey, your funds are getting low from your U.S. bank account, this is a warning message and it's legitimate as all get out, it's still better to say, okay, bring up your browser and go right to usbank.com all on your own. It's a much better idea to do that than click on the email, because when you click on the link in the email, we can't verify where they go. I have seen some that are very sophisticated. You even hold the mouse over and it shows where it seems like it's going, a legitimate site, and it's not. It's maybe using some kind of JavaScript that actually points elsewhere. So be very, very careful. I always say a good rule of thumb to always be safe, don't click on those links. Never, never do that. Okay, so how do we stop this stuff? First of all, as I've shown you, user training. One of the best ways to stop this is to show actual users, here are some historical phishing attempts. Look at how some of these work. Can you see why they were effective? Can you see the mistakes? Can you spot the errors? Can you actually find ways to protect yourself against some of this? So user training is actually very, very helpful in many cases. The problem is getting users to see the importance of all of this, right? So we can sit all day long and drone about this, as I might be doing, but we need to really help users understand, hey, this is important, and you giving bad guys your information is very, very, very bad for you. And you may lose money you will never get back, unfortunately. Okay, so this is one very good way that we can stop it, is user training when we get the opportunity to do it. Make sure your user training is relevant, interesting, and to the point. Okay, so and then users, of course, need to see the impact of what happens when they give their credentials away. Okay, so a couple easy tips here. First of all, tell your users, think before you open. Always think about this. Is this legitimate? Does it look legitimate? Should I, think about clicking a link? Instead of clicking a link, just go to the browser and enter it in manually. Those kinds of things. Very, very important. So I like that whole think before you open tip. I think it's very, very useful. Also, with the URL itself, we need to teach our users, look for HTTPS. Remember, this S right here typically means it's standing for HTTPS. So the S is for secure, so it's using SSL-based certificates. Now, I can tell you, and anyone who's a security practitioner can tell you, just because it says HTTPS does not mean it's foolproof. It does not mean that at all. There are still ways to fake certificates. There are still ways to deliver HTTPS, and you look for a user that doesn't know how to look at the certificate technically. It might say HTTPS, and it might be an HTTPS encrypted site, but it's not going to the right place. So be very careful of those kinds of things. Also, there are what's called man-in-the-middle based attacks that can bypass, or maybe not bypass, but sit in the middle of a real conversation. So we need to be very careful of those things. The EV certificates are nice. Stands for extended validation, but again, I want to say the same thing. Just because it may be an EV cert doesn't mean that it's safe. Here's an example of an EV cert. Notice how it shows green up here. This is a EV. What it means is essentially they've gone through some extra checks to get this certificate. It's not just your typical certificate. Now, it is the same level of encryption as a normal certificate, but PayPal has had to go through some extra steps to verify themselves to get this EV cert. Okay. So, but typically EV certs are better. Doesn't mean they're secure, doesn't mean you'll never get pointed to a fake site with an EV cert, but they are better. And by the way, pretty much any vendor ought to have an EV cert. If they are a major bank, if they are a major financial provider, they should already have an EV cert. And if they don't, it's somewhat embarrassing. So you need to pretty much expect that green cert to come up there, that green EV cert. Okay, so here's an example of PayPal's, for example. Okay. Even if the email seems suspicious, just don't open it. Here's another big one. Tell your users, if they work for your company, if you are at all suspicious of an email, just don't open it. Call up your IT guys and let them come take a look. We need to have a posture as IT people, a very encouraging, open posture, and say to our users, if for whatever reason you don't trust what you see, thank you for not trusting it, first of all. Thank you for being wise enough to say there's something here that doesn't sit right with me. And then, by the way, you call us right up and we'll come right over and look at this for you. Or if we have a method of connecting your machine and looking at it with you, we'll do that and we'll make sure it's legitimate and we'll encourage you. We'll say thank you for doing that. We'll say thank you for taking time out of our day to make sure that this information is legitimate, even if it is. And we as IT people need to say, hey, thanks for letting me know. And even if it was legitimate and took 10 minutes out of your day, isn't it better to have 10 minutes taken out of your day right now to make sure something's legitimate than spending hours and hours and hours and hours recouping the damages that may cause? So as IT people, let's encourage people to say, hey, is this legit? Can you tell? Can you look at it for me? Can you give me your advice? Because remember, we're the pros here. We should be doing this. Another thing, use up-to-date web browsers. I have noticed, I've done some presentations lately on man-in-the-middle attacks, and I've noticed that the new versions of Chrome and Firefox and even IE10, to be honest with you, are much more difficult to perpetrate some of these man-in-the-middle based attacks where we can use a phishing attempt to point a user somewhere false. So new browsers really do help, and I'm not going to go over some of the technical reasons for that. I do in some of my other presentations, but trust me, the new browsers are nice. So always recommend to a user, use Chrome, use Firefox, make sure it's always updated. Good way to go. And then, of course, keeping your AV signatures up to date doesn't mean you're going to be completely protected, but if the phishing link points to maybe some malware, it might get caught, so it's a good thing to have. Now, web developers. How do we stop phishing attacks for web if you're a web developer? Here's something I want to suggest. Two-factor authentication. Now, if you haven't heard of this, two-factor authentication is essentially this: combining two methods of logging in. Typically, we see one-factor authentication, and typically that one factor is a password, right? So I go to a website and I try to log in, I put in my username and my password. That's one-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is fantastic, and here's why. It requires us to enter in something that we know, for example, like a password, with maybe something we have, like a smartphone, right? And maybe this smartphone has a security app on it, and maybe this security app is what's called a part of a two-factor authentication system. It's got a rotating string of text that I have to enter in. So you see this right here with our Google Authenticator, and it's given me 966286. And maybe that's going to rotate here in about 5 minutes, right? So I have to enter in a username, and I have to enter in a password. And if I always know as an end user, I have to enter a username and a password, and I'm ever delivered to my bank's website, and I don't get two-factor, I get one-factor, I immediately know it's suspicious. I immediately know something's wrong with it. So entering in or incorporating two-factor, yeah, it makes me have to have 2 steps to log in, but the advantage of it is over time, I'm used to always saying two-factor, so if I get phished and sent to a fake website that's trying to take my password and I don't see two-factor with it, I immediately say this isn't right. Now, what happens if the phishing attack attempts to use two-factor, right? Well, that could be a problem, right? However, at this point in time, we haven't seen very many phishing attacks that involve two-factor based attempts, so fortunately that's helpful, but do keep in mind that even if we put in a username and then a fake password, and they harvest that, they take that information from us, they still aren't going to log in because they don't know what that rotating password is. So the advantage is with two factors, even if someone ends up getting my password, they still don't have access to my account because they don't have my phone. They don't know what that rotating set of characters, set of numbers, typically is what it is going to be. So that's why two-factor is so nice, because even if I could even verbally tell you my password is Happy Puppy Cats, right, which is a great password, and then but they don't have my my rotating smart ID, whatever that happens to be, then guess what? That password really gets you nowhere. So two-factor authentication is super, super nice. So here, again, I'm showing you an example of a couple of them that may be very helpful to have, okay? Also, if you're a web developer, be careful about the code that you write. Always make sure your code checks for bad user data. So if a user, a bad guy, happens to enter in malicious data, we're going to detect it. We're going to ignore that data or blacklist that data and say, we're not interpreting this data. Now, we'll talk about this more in scenario 2, but this could be really, really helpful. So just being aware that your code is properly written, that we're checking for bad user data that may be delivered to me. Okay, so we want to make sure of that as well, and that can be very, very helpful. What about network administrators rather than a coder? Well, we can use modern spam filters, right? A good idea is to have firewalls that are sophisticated and have spam filtering built in, and maybe some of this filtering is, first of all, based on IP reputation. So maybe when we are pointed, a user is pointed to some website, wherever it goes, whether it's by a phishing attack or a Google search or whatever, and it goes to an IP address that's known to be malicious, either historically or recently, then we just blacklist it. We say, hey, you know what? We're not going to allow you to go there because we know this is not a good site. And actually, if you've seen, occasionally, I'll click on a link because sometimes what I do in security work, I'm looking for malware or whatever, and Google will blacklist for me. I've even seen Google searches doing this. So it's a good idea to have a corporate firewall that can block traffic, can block destinations of our users based upon known bad IP addresses. So that's one thing. Another thing that would be nice for a filter to have, a firewall to have, is sender authentication. Now, these aren't perfect, but what these are going to do is say, hey, we're going to authenticate that where you're trying to go is legitimate. So if we have a user on our network that's trying to send out spam, we're going to authenticate and make sure he's actually going the right place. And when email comes in, we might be able to authenticate it and say, we're going to make sure this actually came from the correct sender. Make sure whoever sent this to us is truly there and truly real. Because what a lot of spam, a lot of phishing attacks will do is they'll come from a false sender. It might be a real email address, but it didn't really come from them. And what you will notice as you start learning about email, it's very, very easy to send a fake email from a fake person. Very easy to do that. So sender authentication, making sure that whoever actually sent the email is really that person, is very, very helpful. Another thing that can be nice is content filtering. So not just IP rep and sender auth, but also content filtering. Let's check and see what the email has in it. Does it look suspicious? Does it have known words? Or maybe we've seen another email that's almost exactly like it. And we say, we know based on pattern match, this is a phishing attempt. We've seen the same language. We see the same way it's written. Now, unfortunately, content filtering doesn't always work that well. It's very easy to just change a few small things and get past a content filter. The good thing is that once we see it come through once, if someone tries to send it to another 200 of my users, then it's pretty much identical. Content filter will catch it. So content filters are nice. They do cause problems. Sometimes they'll flag something as malicious or suspicious that's not. And then on the other hand, sometimes they won't catch something that it should have. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. They still are overall more helpful than not. Okay, we're going to take a break here at scenario 2, and we're going to pick up here in the next video series.